Hey, I'm Crimson and welcome to my Game Asset Workflow course. In this series, you'll learn how I go about creating an asset for Unreal Engine use. Please note, this isn't a modeling course per se, but I will cover a few tips and fundamentals while modeling, UVing, and texturing to make sure you can create models efficiently. By the end of this course, you should know how to go from a high poly model to an optimized low poly model fit for games. This course will go through the pre-production, modeling process, UVing, baking, and texturing, and finally, importing into Unreal Engine. Buying this course, it also includes original scripts and written versions for those that learn better by reading, project files, and a resources text file so you can read from more sites and sources that I recommend. Before getting this course, there's a few pieces of software you'll need to follow along. Blender, which is a free 3D modeling software, or your software of choice. Substance Painter, which costs around $170 in Canadian dollars on Steam, which is needed for texturing and baking. Unreal Engine 4, which is a free game engine, which will be using the version 4.26. And optionally, you don't technically need this stuff, but I do recommend it. PureRef, it's a free piece of software that can be used for laying out images and references. ShotPacker, a paid add-on for Blender, used for packing UVs. Alternatively, there's some other UV packing add-ons out there that you can also use. If you haven't bought the course yet, you can find it on Gumroad. If you're watching it now, I hope you're able to learn a few new things. Have a good one, and happy modeling. Hey, I'm Crimson, and welcome to the very first part of this 5-part series for my game asset workflow. In this episode, we're going to go through the pre-production that goes behind creating a prop, which includes planning how the prop will be used, gathering references, preparing your scene in your modeling software of choice, and blocking out the model. Let's get right into it. Let's start by going through some of the key details for this asset and what we'll need. Obviously, this is something that you'll end up doing mentally as you make more stuff, but sometimes it's good to have some information written down. For this course, I'll be creating a military crate, specifically inspired by a Pelican case. It's always good to know some products in real life that you'll be taking some inspiration from. Keep note that you don't specifically need to make a crate while following along. In fact, I recommend picking your own object if you intend on modeling while following this video course. Here's a few key details you want to think about before beginning modeling. What is the asset? Where will it be placed? How often will it be used? How large is it? Will it need multiple materials? Is it a key piece of an environment? Example, a hero asset. Will a specific company manufacture this object in your game's world? Generally, any details that you'd want to think about beforehand. That way you have all of this stuff planned out before going into modeling. Of course, though, you can also think through some of these details as you're modeling. Once you figured out those details, you could begin searching online for references. To keep all of your references organized in one place, you can use a program called PureRef. You can simply drag images from Google into PureRef without having to save them in a folder, which makes it super easy to quickly gather references in a short period of time. It's important to have a ton of different views, like a top-down view, side view, maybe even other objects similar to the one you're creating, and potentially also finding out the scale of the object in the world next to a humanoid. Once you're done gathering references, you can go on ahead in your modeling software of choice. I personally like using Blender, so that's what I'll be using. For those curious, I have a few things enabled in my Blender viewport to make modeling a little easier and to make the viewport look better in general. Firstly, you can play around with the matte cap settings in this drop-down menu. And then I like to turn on cavity and outline. Alright, now that you have your matte cap and viewport settings out of the way, the next step is saving this project somewhere. From there, the very first thing I like to do is import a size reference in the scene. It's crucial that your modeling software matches up with the scale of the game engine you're using. That way you can efficiently work on props without having to guess what your object's scale will be. I provided a size reference mannequin in the files folder. It's just a super low LOD version of the Unreal Engine mannequin. Now that you have a size reference in your scene, you can begin working on your model. The very first thing that I like to do is start with primitive shapes to create the blockout. The blockout is super important. You want to work your way up in detail on the whole object. The blockout also allows you to get an understanding of your object's scale, which you can then test by doing a quick export and seeing how it'll be in Engine. You don't want to put too much detail in the blockout stage. Your goal in this stage is to just get primitives in so you can get a general idea of your model's scale. Once you've completed your blockout, you can head into the next step. Hey, welcome to part 2 of this 5-part series of my game asset workflow. The high poly to low poly workflow has been around for a while and is very common in the game industry. It's a way of pushing more details into a model without having to add additional geometry, and is a crucial skill you'll need as a game artist. Keep in mind that the high poly is not imported into your game engine. It's primarily used for the texturing process to bake your normal map, ambient occlusion, and more. Something I like to point out before we get into this episode, this process won't be using ZBrush, so some of the topology and flow won't be fit for sculpting a model. This is more so a hard surface modeling workflow. I'll explain in more detail what I mean by this as we get to the high poly modeling stage. Alright, no more chit chat, let's get right into it. My workflow is a little different than others, but it heavily depends on what kind of object I'm making. I like to start with the low poly, working on it right after my blockout, which is a different method from the typical high poly to low poly workflow, where you would actually go straight into the high poly. Typically after creating the high poly, you would also retopologize it, and that's how you would create your low poly. But what we're basically doing is cutting out that whole part and starting with the low poly and then working our way up and then kind of going back down, seeing what we can change and clean up. My opinion, I like this a lot more because you're basically saving a bit of time, especially for a hard surface object like this. For an object like this, which is relatively hard surface, I'll do the same workflow. That way the low poly is generally already complete. I'll also switch back and forth to make sure both are consistent. For the low poly stage, I want to make sure that the model has all of the pieces I'll be keeping as geometry. Sometimes I may miss a few pieces while working on the high poly, but luckily that won't be an issue since we'll have both the low poly and high poly in separate scene collections. I'll talk about that later on. You want to make sure that your low poly mesh is generally 90% complete. That way you won't have to make gigantic changes after finishing your high poly. This is inevitable though. It will happen once in a while, but you want to try your best to have the shape you want in your low poly before going into the high poly. I highly recommend using the mirror and array modifier as much as you can in this stage. That way when you get into the high poly, you'll have consistent modifiers, which can save you tons of time in the UVing stage as well. You probably already know this, but use any tricks you can to save time when creating assets like this. Your goal is to be able to finish small models like this in one day, if possible. Of course though, if your model is larger or holds more importance, like a hero asset, you'll probably need multiple days. Alright, once you've completed your low poly, or most of it, we're going to start setting up for the high poly. You may notice that some pieces aren't mirrored just yet. Technically at this stage we won't need them. We'll simply mirror them later on. Something unrelated to the low poly or high poly, but is good to think about for down the line when you bake and UV your mesh, is to think about what pieces will be arrayed or overlaid on top of each other in the UVs. That way you can save UV space while using the same piece over and over. As you can tell with this military crate, we have a ton of pieces that are reused. I'll be overlaying these pieces on top of each other in the UVs. I'll go into more detail about that when we're UV unwrapping in part 3. Moving on, now that your initial low poly is complete, you'll want to move it to a proper scene. Select all of your low poly objects in object mode and hit M for Move to Collection. You want to create a new collection and call it something like low poly. This way we can keep our low poly in a specific collection. Now we'll want to duplicate all of our low poly by hitting Shift D. Make sure the object isn't linked since we'll be using this as our high poly. Without hitting any other buttons, hit right mouse button or escape to leave the duplicated object in the same location. We'll hit M again to create a new collection, and this will be called high poly. This is super handy because now you can cycle back and forth from your low poly to your high poly by simply pressing the 1 or 2 key on your keyboard. Additionally, you can show both by hitting Shift while hitting the number keys. This is handy because you'll be able to see how different the geometry is from your low to your high. Now that you've organized your low poly and high poly into their own collections, we can go on ahead into the high poly collection and begin working on the high poly. There's a few key important things about a high poly. You'll need to use a subdivision modifier to make sure there's enough geometry and smoothness for the baking to go well. I can't fully go into detail about how a high poly to low poly bake works, but in short, we are basically telling the baking program to modify the direction that the low poly normals follow, so that they match the direction of the high poly model. As a result, the low poly model is bouncing light as the high poly would. All this information is stored in a texture called the normal map. That's a quote from 80 level. There's a link in the resources.txt file if you want to learn more about how it all works. So if you add a subdivision modifier and put the viewport subdivisions to 2, you'll notice that your mesh is now smoothing. This is part of the high poly process. The next thing we'll have to do is start adding in support loops, alternatively named triple edging or control loops. You essentially are controlling how the mesh will smooth and subdivide. Adding more edges closer to another edge will focus more geometry there, tightening and sharpening those edges. You want to do this throughout your mesh, adding control loops where it's needed to get the desired shape. One super important thing to note is you're not following realism for this, so you don't want to move edges too close to one another and create super sharp edges. This will result in a poor normal map bake. You want to create a nice consistent edge that won't be too sharp so the bake looks good from afar. Additionally, in this step, you can start adding in geometry that'll bake on top of your low poly, but not occupy any additional geometry in the low poly. Things like screws and much more. From here on out, it's just about adding more details and finishing up your model. I'm going to go through some tips and tricks to really push your high poly even further. Tip number 1. Using bevels to create triple edges is a great non-destructive method. It has some control, but not as much as manually putting edges in your model, in my opinion. You can easily do this by adding a bevel modifier to your object, setting the segments to 2, and setting the profile to 1. From here, you can get even more control by setting the limit method to weight and manually setting which edges you want to bevel. You can set edge bevel weights by going into edit mode and selecting edges, then hitting Ctrl E. From there, you can select edge bevel weight, then hit 1 to set the edge to the max weight. To unweight an edge, do the previous steps and instead hit -1. Make sure your bevel modifier is before your subdivision modifier, by the way, since modifiers do follow in an order of operation. Tip number 2. Filling in back faces of your objects in the high poly is a great way to add more detail to your mesh. The worst thing to do is not fill in these faces. You want to imitate that the object has screws, innards, all that stuff that would add realism to your model. There's a bunch of ways you can apply this to your models. In doing this, you're putting in that extra effort that goes a long way. Do not neglect these small details. Tip number 3. This is an obvious one, but you aren't limited to only using one mirror. You can use multiple mirrors on one object. Utilizing empty mirrors is a great way to duplicate an object throughout your model, similar to how I used 2 mirrors for this one clamp. All you have to do is place an empty where you want it, and then use that as your mirror object. Then you can add another mirror and just use the object's location to mirror on the other side of your object. This is great because now I only have to edit one object rather than 2. Of course, you can also create duplicates that are linked, but I feel like those may cause some issues down the line. In the next episode, we'll go through sharpening your low poly's edges, using weighted normals, UV unwrapping, and all of the methods I use to optimize my UV space. It should be a good one. Hey, and welcome back. This is part 3 of my 5-part game asset workflow. In this episode, I'll be covering how you can UV unwrap your assets, which also includes how to set up your low poly so it's ready for baking. There's a few things I'll cover in this video. I'll be covering weighted normals, sharpening edges, renaming your objects for efficient baking, some UV unwrapping tricks to save time, avoid artifacts, and optimize UV space, and using a packing add-on like ShotPacker. Let's get right into it. Now that you have both your low poly and high poly out of the way, there are a few things we'll need to do in preparation for UV unwrapping. The first thing is utilizing weighted normals, which makes use of bevels to control your normals. This is also great for other assets that use tileable materials and is relatively inexpensive. You'll be adding this to your low poly. It's super easy to add in weighted normals. First, select the object you like to add weighted normals to, then add the weighted normal modifier. Set the weight to 100 and keep sharp on. That's for when you add sharpen edges, which we'll cover after this. You'll also notice a warning that says enable auto smooth option in mesh settings. To resolve this, you'll want to go to your object data properties. It's the green triangle icon. Then you want to go to the normals dropdown and turn on auto smooth. Make sure you're setting the angle to 180 so you have full control of how things are smoothed. That's it. You should now have weighted normals on your object. Make sure you also have shade smooth turned on for your object. If you didn't do this, select your object, hit W in the viewport, and then hit shade smooth. Obviously do this in object mode, not in edit mode. Next, I'll cover sharpening edges, which is super important to get the proper look for your low poly if you're not using bevels in certain spots, and will also help when you're baking normals. Since you already set your auto smoothing to on and set the angle to 180, you can begin using sharpened edges. Make sure this is turned on for all of your objects. You may have to do it one by one, sadly. To set a sharpen edge, select an edge in edit mode and hit Ctrl E. Then from there, hit mark sharp and you're done. If you'd like to remove a sharp edge, you can go back into the Ctrl E menu and hit clear sharp. You can also do this in face select and vert select mode. It's important to have edges without bevels that are sharp in your high poly to also be sharpened in your low poly. That being said, it may be healthy for you as an artist to toy around with how this works. That way you can see how things work and can learn more through experimentation. Now that you've sharpened your edges and set up some weighted normals, it's a perfect time to get started on some UV unwrapping. One big thing to note is any sharpened edge needs to be a UV seam. If you don't mark sharpened edges as seams, it'll result in artifacts that look like stitches, which is something you definitely don't want. Here's a quick trick to marking any sharpened edge as a mark seam. Select all of your objects and go into edit mode. From here, select one sharpened edge and then hit Shift G to open the Select Similar menu. Then hit Sharpness, and you now have all of your sharpened edges selected. From here, you can hit Ctrl-E and mark Seam. Now all sharpened edges will be marked seams, which is a great head start in terms of UVing. I won't particularly go into how to UV unwrap since this course is more focused on workflows. I will provide some links in the resources.txt file though for those that want to learn more. Being efficient with your UV space is super important, and luckily we have some mirrored objects that already make this process easier. A big thing you want to think about is what pieces can reuse UV space. That way you can retain the highest level of texture resolution without having to physically increase your texture size. Of course though, you should keep in track that mirrored parts will be the exact same texture, so use this in places where it would make sense and wouldn't show an obvious mirroring or reuse. The goal is to trick the player into thinking that all pieces are unique. While reusing UV space though, it's important to move overlapped UVs one UV space over. This is so any objects that are outside of the UV space won't affect your baked maps like your ambient occlusion. If you don't move the overlap UVs, you may encounter that your ambient occlusion will bake multiple times on top of each other, making pieces seem darker than other objects. For mirrored or arrayed objects, you can do this by going to the modifier and setting the U offset to 1. This will automatically offset the UVs 1 UV square over, which is exactly what you need. For pieces that are already overlapping without a mirror modifier, you can simply select the overlap UVs and hit G, X, and then hitting 1. Obviously, you would do this in the UV viewport. One tip I can give you is to use an add-on like ShotPacker. The really handy thing about this add-on is the ability to stack UVs that are similar to each other. It also packs UVs in a more efficient way than the default UV packing in Blender. It's the same add-on I used for this military crate asset. Now that you've completed the low poly, high poly, and UVing, it's time to prepare the model for baking. To do this, we need to go back and forth from the low poly to the high poly and change the objects' names. You need to make sure you have the same amount of objects for both low poly and high poly. Additionally, objects that are close to each other should be separated to avoid baking onto each other. From there, you should name each object consistently. For example, the body of the crate will be called body_low for the low poly and body_high for the high poly. You should keep the suffix consistent. By default, Substance Painter uses _low and _high as their suffixes. The reason you're doing this is to essentially create a cage for the model. It'll bake each object separately so you don't get any artifacts or errors, like an object baking onto another one that you didn't want. It is unfortunate that this is probably the most annoying part of the workflow. Having a super large model with dozens of objects can be quite tedious, but it is worth it in the end for a super clean bake. Then make sure you export both your low poly and high poly as separate FBXs. Once you've completed that, you are ready for the next step, texturing. Hey, and welcome back. This is part 4 of my 5-part game asset workflow. You've made it this far. It's time to get to the fun stuff, texturing. In this episode, I'm going to go through my baking process, setting up masks, and how I begin work on materials. Then I'll go through some masking tricks, how I add additional details and final touches, and finally, the importance of asymmetry. Let's begin by getting our project set up. Make sure you have Substance Painter opened up and then press File in the top left corner and press New to start a new project. There's a few things you'll have to do in this menu. First, make sure your template is set to Unreal Engine 4 Algorithmic. Then select your low poly under the File section, which is right below the template section. Lastly, make sure your normal map format is set to DirectX and you're good to go. Hit OK and your static mesh will appear. Now that you've selected your low poly and your project is opened up, make sure you save it to a folder. I like to save it in the same folder where the low poly and high poly are located so things are organized. The very first thing we'll do is conduct a test bake to make sure that our high poly and low poly are both set up correctly. Under the texture set settings, scroll down to the mesh maps and hit Bake Mesh Maps. Then only have normal selected and make sure you have these settings or similar ones. Set your output size to a number like 2048. Select your high poly from the high definition meshes section. Scroll down to anti-aliasing and set it to subsampling 4x4 or higher. Finally, set match to by mesh name. This will take advantage of the renaming that we had to do in the previous step. Then from there, hit bake selected textures at the bottom and give it a minute to bake. Once it's complete, take a look around your model and see if there's any artifacts or issues in the normal map. Chances are, if there's errors in the normal map, there will most likely be errors in the other maps. That's why we're starting with the normal map. If you do have any issues, here are a few troubleshooting tips you can go through to attempt to solve the issue. Make sure you have UVs set up for your low poly. Keep in mind you only need UVs for your low poly, the high poly does not need one. Make sure you properly exported your high poly with the subdivision modifier. Additionally, make sure you only selected the high poly in the export. Make sure the locations of both your low poly and high poly are the same. Finally, make sure you're baking in the correct material slot. If you have other types of artifacts that are beyond these troubleshooting tips, like overlaps, stitching, and more, I will be releasing a video discussing common baking artifacts and how to go about fixing them on my YouTube channel in the near future. Alright, once you've got a normal map baked that you're proud of, or if you deal with imposter syndrome, one that you're sort of proud of, you can go on ahead and bake the other maps. You'll need all of them except for the ID map. The ID map is also something I may make a video about in the near future. They're great for masking sections that are in the high poly, but not actual geometry in the low poly. Anyway, give your computer some time to bake these things. Maybe it's time for a coffee. Alright, now that you have your beverage of choice, it's time to get to the fun part, texturing. One important thing to note is I won't completely go through how to texture things, but I will show off a couple things that I've learned that improves the texturing workflow. The very first thing I like to do is set up all the masks and folders I'll need with some base colors, roughness values, and metallic values. This will give you a good idea of how your model will look, and of course, as you work, you'll be able to easily find these base layers and adjust them. To do this, we'll simply add folders for the amount of materials we'll need in this object. Things like the base plastic for the base of the crate, some sort of black glossy plastic for the grips, metal for the clamps, rubber for the wheels, and more. Then, from there, we can add black masks to these folders and start selecting the geometry that it pertains to. This gives us a good idea of what kind of color and material differentiation we're going to have in the asset. It's super important to have different materials in your prop to break things up. It's always the worst when a prop only has one surface type. Try to break things up. The next step from here is setting up some basic normal map details that you'll need to differentiate material types. This is great for breaking up the object's flatness, especially the body of the crate. For objects that have screws, I love to add them in right after setting up all of the base colors. That way I can get an idea of how things will be broken up. For the crate's body, I'm simply using the procedural white noise texture. The next thing you should do from here is figure out some additional macro details. You want to work your way up from macro details down to the micro details. So to start with, I recommend getting some dirt in, metal edgeware where needed, and some basic roughness maps to break up the roughness values in your materials. You can easily slap in some roughness layers that multiply or add on top of the base roughness value, and then layer them on top of each other to get some interesting results. The roughness map is one of the most important maps in the PBR workflow. This is what will give your model life in the 3D view space. In terms of dirt and metal edgeware, I noticed one small bad habit that new artists do in Substance Painter. They just slap the dirt or metal edgeware mask on their material, play around with the values for a couple seconds, and then call it a day. Don't do this. This specific habit is one of the things that'll make your object look way too obvious. You don't want people to think you're using Substance Painter. You want them to assume you did it by hand. But wait, you don't need to do this kind of stuff by hand. You just need to slap some more mask layers on top of these initial masks. You can do this by adding another mask on top of the dirt/metal edgeware mask. Typically, fill mask layers with some kind of procedural texture in it. Then, from there, you can change the blend type from normal to subtract and play around with it for a bit. You can get some interesting results playing around with the blending types and different textures. The key point to focus on here is to break up the repetition that comes in with dirt masks and metal edgeware masks. 9 times out of 10, the object you're working on is not scratched in every little spot. They're usually scratched in specific spots, and that may require some hand painting and manual adjustments, but you can easily break things up with some procedural masks, which is the method I mentioned earlier. I also played around with some bump damage in the crate to really break up the repetition in the base material of the crate. This is done by overlaying a bunch of layers on top of each other, using levels, the blur, and the gradient filters. Then I did some manual work using the paint layer. Using all of these together can bring out some super strong results. You can, however, sculpt these details in the high poly. You may end up saving more time doing that rather than having to create this damage in Substance. But for the purposes of this course, I restricted myself from adding any sculpted details. Another big thing to keep track of when texturing is making sure you're not keeping things entirely symmetrical. Symmetrical design should only be done in very specific places when you're trying to bring in a specific emotion or some kind of perfection. However, this is a military crate. So one thing I did is added this small plate that identifies the crate's number and a few other things. Then I added one on one half of the crate and then put it on the opposite side. I added this by going back to Blender and modeling it and slapping it in an empty spot in the UV map. Then I duplicated it and placed it in a couple places on the crate. Remember how we talked about overlapping UVs in a previous episode? Well, all of that stuff is coming into play for this little plate. That should hopefully help you get a head start in terms of texturing your object and the process you can take to get things going. The more materials you work on, the better you'll become. From here on out, most of your object is done. All that's left is exporting and getting things ready for Unreal Engine. Hey, and welcome back. This is the final part of my 5-part game asset workflow. You've gone through the majority of the workflow. It's time to bring it all together in your game engine now. Before you open up your game engine though, you'll need to export your textures from Substance Painter. For this, I'll be using a packed texture workflow, which is great for saving time and file size. To export your textures, you can either hit Ctrl-Shift-E or go up top to File, Export Textures. Before exporting, you'll want to create a new output template. Click on the tab up top named Output Templates. Then you want to press the plus button in the top left corner to add a new preset. You can name it anything. I recommend Unreal Engine 4 Packed. You should see on screen how I set this up, but I'll go into detail. The T underscore in all of the output maps are a prefix. This is great for keeping your files organized in your content browser. Then you have the $ texture set. This will essentially export using the name of the texture set or the material slot name. You can rename the texture sets in Substance Painter, so make sure you name it something nice like Military Crate. The _D is a suffix. There's 4 suffixes in total here. We'll only be exporting 3 for now. _D is the diffuse or base color. _RMAO is the packed texture, which includes the roughness, metallic, and ambient occlusion. And finally, _N is the normal map. To add these, you'll want to create a RGB plus A R plus G plus B, and an RGB. The RGB plus A is the diffuse, the R plus G plus B is the packed texture, and the RGB is the normal map. You can drag the input maps in the respective slots. I'll go into detail which slots to put things in. For the diffuse, put the base color in the RGB, then select RGB channels. In the A, we'll put the opacity and select A channel. This isn't something we used, but it's good to have this set up for the future. For the pack texture, put the mixed AO in the R and select gray channel, put the roughness in the G and select gray channel, and finally, place the metallic in B and select gray channel. The reason we're putting the roughness in the green channel and not in the red is because the green channel contains the most information. I don't really know why, it's probably some computer mumbo jumbo, but we need to make it so the roughness holds the most data, so it's important to keep it in the green channel. From there, you can head back to the settings section in the top left. You want to select your new output template in the output template section. Additionally, make sure you're selecting the folder you'd like to export the textures to. I like to export my textures as PNGs, however you can choose other options. Then we're using 2048 as our size and Dilation Infinite as the padding. Now, you've exported your textures and you're ready to start importing these into Unreal Engine or your game engine of choice. So, launch up your game engine. For this, I'll be going through the importing and setup process in Unreal Engine. Begin importing your low poly FBX and the textures you've just exported out of Substance Painter. One very important thing to note is to go into your pack texture and turn off sRGB, which can be found in the settings for this texture. Since this packed texture is all grayscale and follows 0 to 1 values, Unreal Engine needs to know this. Turning off sRGB will turn this texture into a linear grayscale texture. Now, let's create a material, but I'm going to go through a bit of a different process. That way you can create material instances with props that use the same texture layout, and you'll save lots of time compiling shaders. What we're going to do is create what I like to call a master material. So, let's create a material and call it m_prop_master, or anything you'd like to call it. From here, we're going to add in the textures we've just imported by drag and dropping them in the material graph. But instead of tying these into their specified inputs, we're going to right-click each one and turn them into texture parameters. Rename each one to their respective inputs like diffuse, RMAO, and normals. Now, we're going to hook these up into their proper inputs. We'll put the diffuse or base color where it should go. The RMAO is split up into 3 colors. The red goes into the ambient occlusion, the green goes into the roughness, and the blue goes into metallic. Finally, the normals go into, well, normals, and that's it. You've set up a master material that can be reused for a whole range of props that use the same setup/process. You'll save a ton of time, energy, and compiling time with this process. Now, when you create a new prop that has the same amount of textures, all you have to do is right-click on the master material in the content browser and create a material instance. This will essentially use the same material setup and compilation as the master material, but we can change those texture parameters that we placed on a per instance basis. Finally, we can use that material we created on our crate and we're finally done with our game asset. Thanks for purchasing and watching this course. If you found any issues or require any help, please email me at crimsonstreamer@gmail.com. I really appreciate your support, and I plan on making more courses and resources in the future, so make sure to have a look at my YouTube channel. Additionally, if you want to see some game development live, you can watch me on my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/firstcrimson. Thanks, I hope this video course was of use. Have a good one.